The politics class is next door. So, okay. We stopped in a very bad place, unfortunately, last time, and we skipped a week as well, which makes it even harder. We are near the end of chapter 1. We're going to do today like the last few lines of chapter 1, and then we're going to start chapter 2. And if we finish this entire thing tonight, that would be a miracle. So we're not aiming to finish the whole thing. Yeah. This is probably going to be a 2-week. We may add pages next week and try and we'll see how far we get.
Actually,
especially since we're
maybe
starting
we should
late.
put like a folder, and we should add pages, because otherwise, all those are going to be destroyed. It's a waste.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Okay. We have been talking about the nature of emunah, the nature of faith, and what faith means, what faith in God means. Chapter 1 began by pointing out that faith in God cannot be a commandment, that such a thing would be illogical and would make no sense, the faith that God exists. Then we explained that really when we say faith and that there's a commandment to have faith in God, it's not faith in the fact that God exists, but rather it's to believe about God different things about him, right? And there's different answers. What the Rambam would say faith in God means is to believe that he is the highest, the first and the highest of all beings. Yeah, and he's a necessary being. His existence is necessary and not only possible. Then we explained that according to Kabbalah, according to the higher understanding, this itself is also knowable. That we can also know that God is the necessary being, who's the first being, that everything else needs him to exist and he needs nothing else to exist. All of that can also be known. And faith, emunah, what we're talking about, what we're trying to get at in our mimer, is not something. Is for things that can't be known. Is for things that you can't know clearly. So we said that faith. We used Kabbalistic terms to describe two aspects of godliness. Faith is to know godliness and to know God's expression in the way of Sevev Kalamin, in the way that he surrounds all worlds, that there's an aspect of godliness which is not invested in the worlds at all. Knowledge, what's below faith, is in Mamale Kalamin, is in that aspect of godliness which fills the world. And even that which can be known, even the aspect of God which fills the world, we explained that we explained that can be known, and we explained that you can. It's as if you see it. We explained it with the phrase "Mibsari echza Eloka," which is from Job, from the book of Eov, that from my flesh I see God, and we explained what that means. That everything in the world is really made in the form of godliness, and that by understanding the form of everything and understanding the form of everything in the world, we can know that godliness which is invested within the world. We can know the mamale kolamin, and we use the example that we use, which in fact we're going to talk about further later. The example we used is that the mamale kolamin, that God fills the world, God is invested in the world, the way that a soul is invested in a body, and just as when you look at a person and you see that they're alive and that there's a soul and that there's a force that makes them alive, that is not their body. There's something inside of them which makes their body be alive and makes them be a living human being. That is the soul, and that thing, you know for sure that it exists, and that's why we say you can see God from your flesh. We say you can see it because seeing implies a certain amount of truth. That seeing is believing. That when you know something so well that you have no doubt that it's true, nothing can convince you otherwise. That means knowing it as well as seeing it with the mind's eye. And for something like that, we concluded, you don't need faith. That you can know, because that's something which is clear to you. It's like it's right in front of your eyes. So why would you need faith for that? That faith is for something else. Faith is for higher aspects of godliness. That's what we said last time. Okay. Ela al zen nemar.
Question about
you can
prayer.
See prayer. Okay.
Now, I think
is
what
it
you
connected
said,
to what we've been talking about?
Maybe.
Okay.
Well, it has to do with faith.
Okay.
Faith, and we pray because we have faith. Correct.
In what sense? What do you mean?
In other words, there's no sense in praying if you don't have faith.
If we're saying faith that God exists, then under the definitions we're using in this discourse, no, we pray because of our knowledge that God exists. The idea that God exists, that there is a God, as we explained last time, is something which Hasidus views as completely knowable. We don't believe that the idea that God exists is something that we take on faith.
You need faith for.
That is not something you need faith for. We see that as very logical. As to why people don't see that as logical today and why that seems to be a matter of controversy, I could give a whole history class. That could be a whole class in and of itself, and probably a very interesting one. But philosophic, the Hasidus holds of the classical Jewish philosophy from the Middle Ages, and sort of the classical and the scholastic proofs of God's existence, which.
All right, so prayer is based on knowledge, not faith.
No, faith, maybe faith as well, but I'm saying when you say you need faith to pray, that's not necessarily true.
But it must, one brings the other. Because if God doesn't exist, you cannot, believe in it.
No, the point is that the idea that there is a God, that there is someone to pray to, has nothing to do with faith necessarily. You can know that there is a God to pray to. In terms of what we're saying in our mimer, right? This is why
we know there's a God. Now, where does faith come in?
Faith comes in. Faith is a connection to those super rational aspects of God, which are unknowable. And actually, that's the topic of tonight's class and possibly the next 2 or 3 classes.
So that's an emanation.
Yes. Really, what you know is also an emanation. It just doesn't maybe seem that way as obviously.
Okay. Now, I think you said that God is not per se spiritual. God is God.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
That's when we say that we're knowing and we're having faith. This is both of them are aspects of godliness rather than.
But God has different names. Yes?
Sure. Yes.
So does one pray to one of the different names, which is one of the different emanations?
No, you don't. No, that's a very good point. That's a very good point, though, because now I kind of see what you're saying, in terms of that you need faith to pray to God. I see what you're saying, because we don't pray to any expression of God or any level of God. We don't pray to any of the different aspects of godliness we're describing. We pray to God Himself. But the God we pray to, the God Himself that we pray to, is you wouldn't call that faith under the definition of our mimer either. What you'd probably call that is you'd say you pray with the simplicity of a child. That's that precondition for prayer, that you pray to God alone and you have absolutely no idea what He is, and you don't even begin to really enter into the question of what He is. You just know. You're taught as a child, like a small child who prays. You're taught that there's a God, so you pray to God, like the big Father in the sky. That's before this entire enterprise starts. In other words, before you begin the process of knowing and coming to have faith and having a super rational connection to God and a super rational connection to Him and those aspects of Him which are not invested in the creation, there's the simple, what you could call the simple faith of a child. That's not what we're talking about here, though.
So you're really saying is you pray to the truth of God.
Yeah, you pray, you don't know what you're praying to even, right? That's the point. What we're talking about in knowledge and faith, these are actually, these fall upon an object, if you understand what I'm saying. The praying to God is you just pray to the God that you've been told about. If you want to know anything, yeah, but if you pray, well, not as a small child, whatever. If you pray to sure, to some extent. That's why there's an obligation to know God.
Right.
But that's not a prerequisite for prayer. The idea that there is, the simple idea that there is a God is for sure a prerequisite for prayer. I don't know whether that falls under the category either of the knowing or the faith that we're talking about here. We can maybe say it's even higher than the faith we're talking about here. I don't know. That's a good question. It's a good question. It's worth thinking about. In any case, you're right. Good point.
I don't see the difference, but anyway, I guess there is some.
There's definitely a difference. We may talk about it later in the mimer. Okay. Fine. Rather, upon these aspects of godliness, we're under the line where I've marked here as the starting line. Sorry, I marked the wrong line. I marked one too early. On this it said, know the God of your fathers. It's from Divrei Yomim, Book of Chronicles, Chronicles 1. First Chronicles, I think you would say. I think Chronicles 1 is what the president-elect would say. Not everything has to lead back to him. This is what it says, know the God of your fathers. That this, the aspect of godliness which is invested in the world, which in other words really means the God of the world, right? God as he is God over the world. An expression of godliness, an expression of God expressing himself as the God of the world. He's wearing his hat as the God over the world. This can be known in a way of knowledge. Upirush das hu lashon hargasha. And what do we mean by knowing? This is actually what we're going to be talking about a lot. What do we mean by knowing? That you can know God. Das, the word das. What does it mean? Das means to know, really means to feel, which is very interesting. To know means to feel, to be moved by something. Kameiva Adam Yada, as the famous verse says, and Adam knew Eve, as it says in Genesis, meaning he had an intimate relationship with her. This is called knowing her. So when we say you can know God in this way, knowledge, the word das, as opposed to there's many words for intellect in Hebrew, for intellection, for cogitation. There's chachma, there's bina, there's seichel, there's hasaga. There's lots of different words for knowing, understanding, grasping something intellectually. Das is actually different. Das does not mean a pure, when we say knowing, we don't mean a pure intellectual knowledge. We mean an emotional relationship. We mean to feel, to know something as so true that it impacts you emotionally. That's the idea of das, of knowledge. Because something which is grasped through the mind's eye is felt and is not mere faith. Because something that you have faith in is not felt by the person, right? This is an example of how we know that the emunah we're talking about here is not the faith of the simple child who's praying to God. The faith mentioned here, the faith that we're going to be talking about in this mimer, which is the more, how should we put it, the more rigorous definition of the word faith, of the Hebrew word emunah, which is really what we're going into tonight. I should have said at the beginning. What we're going into tonight, and possibly for the next 2 weeks, is about, we're all going to be talking about the difference between faith and knowledge at great length. This is where we're going to talk about that. The difference between having faith in God and knowing God. And not just in terms of what aspects of godliness we can have faith or we can know. That's more like what we talked about last week. The next week or two, we're going to be talking about what it means from the person's end. What does it mean in our experience to have faith and to know? And it turns out that they're very different. The two things are very different one from another. They're not the same. So here is one of the first major distinctions. To know something means to have an emotional reaction. To have faith in something, faith is not felt within the person. Right? This is something that we need to understand, because this is actually almost directly contrary to the common usage of the term faith. When people say faith in English, or when lahavdil, a Christian says faith or something like that, they mean something very different than what and even a secular person says faith. They mean something very different than what we're talking about here. So when someone says that their faith moved them to do something, right? They're using a very general definition of faith. We want to be very rigorous and very specific. We want to be almost mathematical and philosophical, scientific. We want to be very precise. If you have a relationship with something and you know it well enough, you have a close enough relationship, you relate to it well enough that it moves you, that's not faith.
That's knowledge.
That's knowledge. It's either knowledge or it's faith that has been internalized to knowledge, but it's not faith alone. The famous example of faith alone, which comes from the Gemara, it's funny because the Alter Rebbe says it comes from the Gemara, but it's not actually in the regular Gemara as it's printed. It's from a different girsa of the Gemara, which is, some of them are printed in separate svarim. They aren't even printed in the regular Vilna Shas, whatever. That's all a separate thing. But it says in the Gemara, talks about the case of what's called in Aramaic, Ganva afum machtarta rachmana karya, which means, is that you may have heard of it before, that a thief who stands in the tunnel calls out to God. What does that mean? It's talking about a case in the Gemara where it says, it's talking about when you can defend yourself with lethal force, in terms of, are you allowed to kill when it says in Torah you're allowed to kill someone before they kill you first, right? So there's many discussions in the Gemara. So how do you know when someone else is what cases count as are there any cases where we can assume someone is going to kill you first, right? So one of the cases where it's assumed someone is going to kill you first is if a thief tunnels into your house at night to steal. It is assumed in the Talmud that if someone is willing to tunnel into your house and to steal from you, you can defend yourself with them with lethal force. You can assume that they'd be willing to kill the people inside. Whatever, there's a whole discussion in the Gemara about it, but that's what it says. And it says in context of that law, or in context of that case rather, that a thief, even as he's tunneling into a home, can call out to God for success in his thievery. Right? This is the classic example of faith, pure faith. Pure faith means that the person believes in God. They have this sort of super rational or distant conception of God, and that conception of God does not impact their behavior or impact them in an emotional way whatsoever. So they believe to God enough that God can impact the success of whether they should tunnel into the house and kill someone and steal from them or not. But they don't believe in God enough that it will stop them from actually doing these things. This is not necessarily all. This doesn't mean that definition of faith there is the exact same as here. But that's, in other words, the Gemara is teaching you about the nature of faith. That's what faith is like.
But this is really misusing the purpose of faith.
Absolutely, but the thing is that that's what pure faith is like. It's not necessarily misusing it. In other words, there's not necessarily any chisaron. There's no lack in that person's faith.
But there is. If I believe this table is a chair,
yeah,
I believe this is a chair, but I'm wrong. So he believes in something, but he believes in a wrong thing.
No, faith. But when we say belief, we don't mean a belief that deeply permeates you and changes you. You have to understand. Everything has, when you start dividing things into levels, when you start looking at things in their details, everything has milas and chesronos. Everything has an advantage and everything has a disadvantage, right? And really, the reason why we say that when we learn Chassidus is because really what we want to say is that there's a reason God created everything. Everything has its place. Everything has a reason it was created, right? So God says God doesn't create anything except for His glory. Everything comes to glorify God in the end, right? That's what we believe Mashiach will be. That everything's godly purpose will be revealed in an open way.
Faith is more of an inclination.
I don't know if I'd say that, but what I was going to say is that everything has its place. So knowledge grasps, by definition, knowledge grasps things that are within our world. They grasp things that we can relate to. Knowledge can have an emotional impact on you, and if you can really know it, that means that it's something that's commensurate to you. It's commensurate to your intellect, and your mind can grasp things even beyond what the heart can fully understand. Bringing them down into feeling is even harder, right? If you can really feel something, that means that the thing that you've grasped is within your world, is really within your existence. When we say faith, as we said last week, we're talking about the soul's ability to have a connection to aspects of godliness which are not even invested in the creation of the world. In other words, the highest thing we can think of, the highest thing we can conceive of, is below where faith begins. This is really the deeper understanding of what we mean when we say that faith begins where the intellect ends, that the intellect grasps only the lower thing, and faith can extend beyond that. Right? We don't just mean that there's lower aspects of godliness and higher aspects of godliness. We mean that in their full definition, intellect means you're supposed to have an emotional relationship with these things. What we're saying here is that the emunah, faith, and to connect to something through faith is not to have an emotional relationship. Faith is a soul connection. It's not something that moves you. It's not something that's within the person. It's something that's above the person.
But you take this word faith and you convert. It's not emunah in Hebrew, because emunah could be something else. Like, I believe I can do it. Is that
right? That's why I'm saying we're using very technical definitions of the words. That's what I'm saying. We're being very rigorous. We're saying there's this thing called faith, and we're defining it in a very specific way. Right. Not everything someone casually calls faith necessarily would be what we're saying as emunah here. Mm-hmm. We're saying emunah here in the definition that we're explaining, which is the soul's connection to those aspects of godliness which cannot be grasped by intellect. That soul connection does not have an emotional impact on the person. Mm-hmm. If your connection to God has an emotional impact on you, at least, let's say, naturally, right, without any further work done, maybe we'll find that emunah can be brought down and to have an emotional impact on you, but it at least requires work. There's something you have to do to the emunah to make it do that. The natural faith that a person has, if your person just has natural qualities and they know something about God and it doesn't impact them, and they have faith, that faith does not necessarily impact them emotionally. Knowledge impacts you emotionally. If you really know, And we're saying here, this knowledge also probably requires work, that it should affect you. That's also not automatic. But the nature of knowledge is that it affects you. True knowledge of something impacts a person emotionally. It means it's not just real in an objective sense. Real in an objective sense, you can do with Chachma and Bina. Real to you is what Das is, and that's what we mean when we say no. So, in summary, there's two aspects of godliness. There's the godliness that's invested within the world, and there's the godliness that remains above the world. The godliness that's invested within the world we relate to through knowledge. Knowledge naturally has an emotional impact on the person. Emunah, faith, which relates to the godliness that remains above the world, does not have an emotional impact on the person, as we're going to explain.
We're talking about, in this case, instances where Jews sacrifice their lives, or things that are totally, when you say faith, is that what we're talking about, where you can't explain acts of faith, where, someone who has never learned, never studied, and is willing to give his life for something that he just has something connection? Or is that not what we're talking about? That to me seems above knowledge and intellect.
I think to some extent it is what we're talking about. The person who gives his life rather than
illogical.
Right, rather than commit heresy, or rather than
what appears illogical.
No, it's illogical.
Yeah.
The thing is that that's not an emotional experience.
No, right.
That's not an emotional impact.
It's
the way it's described in Chassidus is that the person simply can't do this thing.
Right.
It's simply
can't really explain.
No, it's this way and it's no other way. Yeah, that's like faith. Sure.
I think it becomes like an excuse, because actually
What?
an excuse, because there's nothing he can do to save himself. Say, okay, I'm gonna die. At least I'm gonna die for a purpose.
No, it's
But that even that, with no background or understanding of anything, how do you explain that? If a person has no knowledge, zero.
That's how you explain it.
No, that's what I'm saying.
No, they could survive. That's the whole case.
If they convert, they can
The
survive.
case is that a person could convert. They could convert to Christianity, or they could, for example, was a historical example.
Right. Okay, you have that as an example. But he's speaking about someone who knows they're going to lose their life.
Like in the Holocaust, it's like,
They're going to lose life, and all of a sudden they have this amazing, whatever you want to call it, faith. Whatever it is.
That's not what you were talking about.
Okay, so the emunah, the knowledge is within intellect, and the emunah is above intellect. Nevertheless, the Tzemach Tzedek says. So you now may have a question, right? We said before, if you recall, for what we said earlier in the Maimer, we said that. No, sorry, I'm mistaken. I apologize. Okay, so. Nevertheless, it's appropriate for there to be a commandment to know God, right? You may think that if it's something that's easily within knowledge, if this lower connection to God, this emotional relationship with Hashem, which comes from the godliness that's invested within the world, is so obvious, right? If it's so to speak, you can easily know it. It's not something you need to have faith for, right? The whole advantage of looking at the existence of God, right, and the simple understanding of God as purely a faith thing, right? That you need faith to believe that God exists, not something you can know. The nice thing about that is that it leaves the whole life's work just coming to the point where you know that God is there, right? In other words, you can say that you're working towards faith that God exists, right? And the disadvantage is the Jewish way of looking at it, the Chassidus way of looking at it. The disadvantage is that this is an obvious fact that God exists. All the work is beyond that point. That's the first thing, and that's something you can know. It's obvious God exists for sure. What's the question? All the work that you have to do comes after that. Right? So the question then becomes, so how can there be a commandment, as we said earlier, that there's a commandment not just to have faith in God, but there's a commandment to know God? How can there be a commandment to know God as well as to have faith in God? Knowledge, if it's obvious knowledge, then it's just like an obvious thing, right? It's like someone can't come to you in school, and someone can't come to you and tell you there's a commandment to believe that 2 + 2 = 4. It's like, what does that even mean? That's something that I learned when I was very little. I know that it's true, and then you move on to the next thing. So what's the mitzvah? What's the commandment to know God? If it's such an obvious thing, if it's like 2 + 2 = 4, so you learn it once, you know it, and then It's like, what's the mitzvah to know? There's a commandment that a person should know for themselves. What does that even mean? Does it mean learn it once? That would be very unusual. Even the mitzvah of Torah, unfortunately, is you may not know, so maybe bad news in a way. The mitzvah of Torah is also not just to learn it once. The mitzvah of Torah is to be constantly learning it, even someone who knows it all already. Right? I remember once we were sitting in the Beis Medrash in Yerushalayim, and Chassidim have this custom that when they plan for something in the future, they say these are our galus plans, these are the exile plans, right? If Mashiach doesn't come, this is what we're going to do, right? So someone announced after davening what time the Seder was for learning Gemara. Like Talmud will start at 11:30, and someone called out galus plans, and the Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Vichnin, who was walking by, his head in the Beis Medrash, and he says, "Not Mashiach can save you from Talmud. Not even Mashiach can save you." Okay. So what does it mean that there's a commandment to know? The mitzvah is to contemplate and to deepen one's thought in this idea. The mitzvah is not just to know it. The mitzvah is that you have to really think about it. You have to really contemplate it deeply and think deeply about it. Not that this matter should merely come to mind and pass through your thought without any analysis or deep thought. This is not called knowing. This is called hirhur. Hirhur is you just think about something once. It's hirhur. You have a fleeting thought. You have you know that God exists because you thought about it once, and it just it was in your mind and now it's out of your mind. And this is something that you say you know now. This is not called das. That's not called really knowing. Remember, we said knowing means that it should have an emotional impact on you, right? By the transitive property, just thinking about something once or twice does not make it real to you. That doesn't make it have an emotional impact. You have to think deeply about it.
Almost like physical connection.
I don't know what a physical connection means.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, right. Yeah, sure. To know it intimately, make it part of you. You know it well. The Yedua b'Zohar, the Hirhur lo yavidi midi, as it's known from the Zohar that Hirhur does not accomplish anything. Thought doesn't count. In other words, whenever Torah says think about something, it doesn't mean just think about it as a passing thought like a daydream. It means you have to seriously sit down and devote your energy to contemplating this deeply. ולדעת הוא שיעמק מחשבתו בדבר הזה, וזה שנצטווינו בזה במצווה עשה לדעת רבי יונה בשערי תשובה, פסק וידעת היה, יאמר הרמב"ם נכלזו במצווה זו, כמו שעשינו לסלידה למן כמה שיזבוי. And this that we're commanded in a positive mitzvah, according to Rabbeinu Yona, in Sha'arei Tshuva, this commandment comes from the verse V'yadaita hayom, you should know today. And the Rambam includes it in this mitzvah. He says that Anochi, remember, our whole mitzvah here is based on Anochi, the first of the 10 commandments. The Rambam says that to know God and to have faith in God are both from that one verse, which is why the Chinuch wrote, as we quoted on our first day that we learned this, he says Leida Ulahamen, to know and to be. It counts them as one mitzvah. Right, so we're just saying in the parentheses here that there's disagreement over which verse exactly includes this mitzvah to know. And a person should always place it before his eyes. In other words, the idea is you have to think about it constantly. This has to take up mental room by you. That's the mitzvah. The mitzvah is that you should think about it so much it becomes a very real part of your world.
This is the distinction between faith.
No, you think about the knowledge, what you can know about God. You think about how the world, just as the body has a soul in it, and you know that the soul is real, and that there's a soul which gives life to the body. So too the world, and there's lots of details to what you can think about, as we spoke about last week. But so too the world. The world is alive, and the world has a vivifying power in it, and the world is kept in existence at every moment, and it's kept in existence at every moment by God. What we have to think about is those aspects of God which you can understand from the world, as we explained last week. That's what we're talking about the mitzvah here. And this you have to think about constantly. This has to be something that's in your mind always. And we are also commanded. This is like a slight separate issue here. We're also commanded in the verse, you should protect yourself lest you forget God. As it says in the book of Dvarim. That you should not divert your attention from this matter. It's called, that's why it says you can forget about, why does it say you can forget about God? Seemingly, if this thing is true and this thing is obvious from the world, seemingly there's no forgetting about it. Seemingly, how can you even forget about it if it's saying it's so obvious, right? Rather, the idea is, rather, the commandment is that you should not intentionally think about something else, to make yourself forgetful, right? In other words, the fact that there is a God, which you can know according to Chassidus, and the fact that God creates the world constantly, and He's the creator of the world, and all of the life in the world, and the fact that the world exists comes from Him at every moment, this you should not intentionally push to the back of your mind and try and forget it for other things. This is considered by many authorities to be a negative mitzvah of the Torah, one of the 613.
So if we're constantly knowing and contemplating God,
Yeah.
or constantly having feelings, or
I don't know if that's necessarily what we mean. We're actually going to talk about that more as we go on. But it's a fair question. Next chapter we'll talk about this. We'll talk about this more. The Ramban considers this one of the 613 mitzvahs. Siman Aleph, the very first one of the negative commandments, that a person should not forget their faith in God, and this is what he means. And the Rambam does not include this in the 613. The commentary called Megillas Esther already answered there, because it's from one of the general principles, similar to why the Bahag said that faith is not a mitzvah. The Rambam says that not forgetting God is also not a mitzvah, not one of the 613, because it's rather a general principle rather than a specific mitzvah.
So in this parsha, they said in the Midrash that Yaakov met Joseph, so Joseph spoke with him and kissed him and cried, and Jacob said nothing because it's like you shouldn't kiss your kid at shul. He thought if he would cry or do something, it will be like he forsakes the Shiviti Hashem and Vitamid.
Yes, whatever that means.
So he didn't stop thinking about God.
It's a very strange story, but yeah, that is what it says. I think it's brought in Rashi, isn't it? Or is it just a midrash? Synopsis. I'm going to read this quickly. It's a good review. The original question is restated in slightly different terms. How can faith in God be considered a mitzvah when it is the basis of all the mitzvahs? Rabbi Yitzchak Abarbanel attempts to resolve the question by explaining that the mitzvah of faith is not just to believe in God's existence, but to believe that His existence is the most perfect form of being possible. According to Kabbalah, that explanation is accepted but interpreted differently. All existence, from the highest spiritual realms to our material world, is brought into being by a level of godliness, the light that is mamalik olam, the lower level of God's light, the level that relates to this limited frame of reference and includes itself within it. Faith is not required to appreciate this level of godliness. Its existence can be known and grasped intellectually. There is, however, another dimension of godliness, the light that is sovev klamen, the light that it surrounds the world, that transcends limited existence. And this level cannot be comprehended intellectually, it can only be accessed by faith. The Mimer then proceeds to address a secondary issue, whether a commandment to know God is necessary. One might argue that it is not, because God's existence can be readily comprehended and a commandment is appropriate only when effort is required. On the other hand, it can be said the mitzvah to know God involves deepening one's knowledge beyond what is readily comprehensible. That's the synopsis. That's chapter 1. We're not going to get very far in chapter 2, because that took way longer than I thought it would.
Even though, this was the synopsis, still, I want to continue what he was asking. It's kind of hard to have faith unless you recognize. If you look at the dictionary, it says, you cannot define a word with the same terms of, the subject itself.
Okay.
So how can you have faith if you do not recognize by faith that God does exist?
You're saying faith in what?
In God, because how can you have faith in something you do not even know if it exists.
No,
we are saying that faith.
God. The faith is not in the existence of God.
So, what do you have faith in?
So that will come later. Probably that God is the one that
you have faith in the aspects of godliness that are not invested in the world. In other words, you have faith. You have faith in the unknowable God. You have faith that God goes beyond what you know. That's what the faith is in.
Is it possible that people that do not believe in the existence of God will have faith in God?
No.
Under certain
So I don't understand what's. Did I say they did?
No, there's no way. If somebody does not believe in God, he will not have faith in God.
Right, but what you're calling believing in God, we say in Chassidus that you could know. You don't have to believe. You can know. You know that God exists. Faith is something more than that. Faith is, once you know that he exists, there's faith in a God which is also beyond your understanding. There's a God that you understand.
That's
there's
okay.
a God that you, there's also aspects to God that you don't understand.
Right, because part of knowing God is knowing that you cannot know God. It's like, it's
Right.
like too big for you to know.
Yes, but yes, sure. Right.
But you have to have that initial believing in the existence.
Which is
of
not
God.
believing, it's knowing.
Knowing, and then that's the emotional connection.
It's not intuitive. It's not intuitive. You have to.
Yeah, but
It's not,
we
it's
spoke
not, it's
about
not
it.
unintuitive. This is the way everyone used to think about it a long time ago. Now it's unintuitive.
So
Maybe.
can you take anyone who does not believe in the existence of God and convince him that God does exist?
No, because convincing people is a different story. That's something else.
That's
Not
another
convincing someone
No, but
proves.
even if you
not
did,
convincing
after
someone proves
convincing
nothing.
them, they'll know.
But, so proof. It's like, if you know that God does exist, then you can prove.
Yes, I'm surprised no one actually called me on this earlier, because this is really it's quite a big point. There's the whole controversy and the whole thing. Does God exist? Doesn't God exist? This is not a controversy in this context. In
because
Chassidus,
they
this is
take it for granted.
non-controversial.
It's like,
It's
God
not taken
exists.
for granted. They take it as something you can know. You know it just like you know anything else. Not taken for granted. You can go learn why.
You're saying that there is no real bridge between knowledge and the unknown, in a sense. In other words, knowledge translates to emotions. The unknown,
At least potentially, yes.
yeah. So the unknown is something
Right.
that is not
Right.
humanly possible to grasp. Is that what you're saying?
More or less. It's a terrible example, because really you can relate to this, but it's like saying a man in Mongolia just passed away 3 seconds ago. Feel something. It's like, okay, because he's a man, maybe if you're a very good human being, you can find in your sense of shared humanity, you can compare him metaphorically to you. So it's really a bad example, but just very, very roughly. If it was impossible to know anything about that man, right? That's an even better example. Would be that a Martian
If you knew
just
something-
passed away on Venus. Would be a
If
better
you knew
example.
something about
Yeah.
that man,
Exactly.
if you had knowledge, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
That's the bridge,
Knowing, yes, but
but that's still not.
So think about it this way. Even you and I right now, and even a family member, even somebody that you know very well, the question is, how well can you ever really know someone, right? There's an emunah in people as well.
Absolutely.
Right? There's an emunah. How well do you actually know what their soul is? Even your own soul, you don't know what your own soul is.
Absolutely.
It's the same. It's the same idea. It's the same idea. That even if you know them, what you know is not them as they know themselves. You only know the external aspects of them. You know them as they
Different
relate to
faces
you.
of a man.
Yeah, especially someone who's not in your family, someone who you just deal with, even coworkers or things like that. How well do you really know them? Not well at all. And even if you spend your whole life learning about this is just a human being, this isn't God, but because of the nature of the soul, this is part of, when we say man is created in the image of God, this is part of what we mean, that you can
We really
never,
just don't know.
as a person knows themselves, to know another person as they know themselves is very special, and if you can do it, it's certainly not rational.
No, it's not rational. I agree.
Right. That's what we're saying. So we're saying the same thing about God, but on an even bigger scale.
Right.
In a sense. In some ways you can maybe even argue the opposite, right? Because a person's works, how many do they have? God, everything you see in a sense has a relationship with God. So rather than learning about one person, you could learn about the whole world. Maybe that puts you at an advantage. But it's still God at the end of the day. So that's the idea. So the idea that God exists, what we're saying is something that you know, not something that you believe. And the fact that we call it belief in common parlance. This is why I knew this was going to happen, so I said it, if you'll remember, that the common definitions of faith and how faith is normally used in our society is going to trip us up throughout the learning of this minor, because we're not talking about the same thing. So, and I explained to you very briefly the other week what we mean when we say you can know that God exists. It's the classic, very old definition. Things that are created need something to create them. You have the thing that creates the thing that needs something to be created. If it needs to be created, then it needs something to create it. You can't have an infinite regress. It can't go back forever. There must be something that creates everything else that doesn't need to be created, and that thing is God. What?
Could be two things.
Okay, that's a separate issue. You may be right. That's why when you read the books of philosophy, it's not one page.
And it's
But that's the general idea. That's the general idea. It could be forget two things is very unpopular. As much if you want to be one of the cool kids nowadays, you say it was aliens. That's the
That's it.
that's what the cool kids. That's what the cool kids say nowadays. Yeah,
In my day,
or whatever.
In my day, it was Superman.
The universe was created by the universe itself was created by aliens. It's alien simulation.
Yeah, and then everything.
It's a computer simulation. It's the Matrix.
Parallel reality.
Yes, the whole is very cool.
Good movie.
Big Bang is out, huh?
The extent to which people find things that they don't understand interesting is itself very interesting.
Yeah.
We'll just leave it there. It's a type of faith itself, maybe.
It is a type of faith, for sure.
Some radio signals from out of the Milky Way.
Yeah,
Seriously, and
from
they
3 billion light years away. Yeah, I read about that. Whatever that means.
Yeah.
It's God. It's God winking at us.
That, right?
Right.
It's God
Who
winking
can
at
say
us.
it doesn't exist?
God is a man with a long beard, 3 billion light years away.
Yeah. All right.
No. Okay, chapter 2. Chapter 2 is mostly about the difference between faith and knowledge. It's going to be a little, I'm warning now, it's going to be a little hard. Chapter 3 is already going to be more back to interesting, lighter, more easily graspable things. This is a real in-depth look in the light of Chassidus into faith and knowledge. So I'll try to do my best. Let's just put it that way.
Simplify it for us.
I don't want to simplify.
down,
Simplify's like simplify's like lying.
So you know,
So you have to make your mind
your
work.
talent
The whole
as
point of this
a
class is
rabbi
nobody hears me.
to bring it down to a
Okay.
simple form.
Okay.
We
Achlahavin.
don't have to.
Achlahavin. However, you need to understand. So it's terrifying words. L'chura yesh stira l'dvareinu eila. Seemingly, there is a contradiction in our words. Shemetzias Hashem ve'yosem chaya elam ena b'chlal emunah. That the existence of God and that He gives life to the world, which can mean different things in Chassidus, as I mentioned before. When we say He gives life to the world, is mechaya elam in Chassidus. Very roughly, what we often mean is that He creates it at every. He's invested in it to create it at every moment. Ena bichlal emunah. None of this is included in faith. This is all knowledge. Elu b'chinas das mamish. It can literally be known. Seemingly, all of that seems to be contradicted. From the famous statement of the Zohar, that no thought can grasp Him at all, referring to God. It says in the Zohar, no thought can grasp God at all. So correct. That's what we say on Erev Shabbos. The no thought can grasp God at all. So seemingly, we just said that there's this whole aspect of godliness which can be grasped by the mind. But it says in the Zohar, thought cannot grasp God at all. The implication is that the creations cannot grasp Him in their knowledge at all. But the truth is that this presents no real contradiction. It's no real trouble. And they're both true. Everything is true and v'yatziv, and like standing, it stands. And this is according to what the Rambam says. This is all according to what the Rambam says, that you can know His Metzius and not His Mahus. So far, we've had a few dynamic duos. We've had Mamale and Sevev, right, the godliness within the world and the godliness above the world. We've had Emunah and Das, faith and knowledge. And we have a new dynamic duo.
Existence and core.
No, we'll call it existence and essence, although essence is it's almost as bad as faith, a very slippery English word. But we'll call it existence and essence, metzias and mahus. Metzias comes from the Hebrew word matzah or moitze, which means to find. Literally, the thing is found. It is here, right? The thing, in other words, it exists. It's existence. And mahus is a contraction of the Hebrew word. It comes from the Hebrew word mahu. What is it? So you have its existence and its essence. You have that it's here, and you have what it is. And this is a vital distinction. As we'll see, the fact that something is here and what the thing is. When we ask what something is, what do we mean?
What's comprised of? What is its meaning? What is its purpose? Huh?
That's good. What's its purpose? But what if everything has the same purpose? What if the purpose of everything is to glorify God or something like that? So then everything's the same thing. So asking what it is gets you nowhere. Right? In fact, the question what it is at its most, in the oldest and most simple definition, when you ask what something is, you're asking what makes this thing and not something else. That's the real question you're asking. The mahus, the essence of the thing, in the very simple understanding, is what makes the thing it and not something else. Right? In other words, dogs have 4 legs, people have 2 legs. Let's say this is part of the mahus, this is part of the essence. Right? That there exists a creature called a dog is one thing. Someone just tells you there's this thing called a dog. I don't know anything about it. Names, because our language is conventional, it's not the holy tongue, so the name reflects nothing about the thing itself. I don't know what it is at all. Someone just says there's this creature you've never seen before called a dog. Right? So that is the fact that it exists, which is not much.
Kelev is kulo lev.
Right. So you have, which also doesn't tell you that it has 4. How you get that it has 4 legs from kolev is for the Kabbalists to figure out. But the fact that thing exists is the mistake. Right? Like I know, we're going to see just how far this distinction goes, but you could say it's relative. You could say it at lots of different levels, right? I know that there was someone like George Washington, but if there were no painting, I don't know what he looks like, right? There's no paintings of the Mittler Rebbe, of the Alter Rebbe's son, so I know that the Mittler Rebbe existed, but I don't know perhaps what he looked like, what makes him the Mittler Rebbe and not someone else at the visual level, what distinguishes him visually, right? If I learn his Maimarim, then I know what distinguishes him. Intellectually from someone else. Maybe I know that he thought about this concept this way and not a different way. You understand it works at different levels, right? There's different levels of his mahus. If we're dealing just intellectually, there's a different thing that distinguishes him from everyone else. But if we're talking visually, I don't know what his visual mahus was at all. I don't know what made him in his appearance. I have no idea because there's no pictures of him, but I know that he existed, right? Maybe that's an example. Metzias and mahus. We're going to see that it's relative. It can be used at lots of different levels. But there's that the thing is, and there's what the thing is. Okay? V'kenhu b'chol sifrei ha'emes. And this distinction is drawn about God. And the Rambam says that about God, we know that he exists, but we do not know what he is. What's the immediate question? I just said, the Rambam says that we know that he is, but we don't know what he is. What's the immediate question?
Then how do we know?
We do know what he is, right? In fact, we learned in the previous chapter.
No, we don't know what
we do. The Rambam says God is that being which creates everything else, and nothing needs it. He needs nothing else, and everything else needs him to exist. Which is the first sign that it's relative, right? There is an extent to which we know God's mahus, right? There's an extent, right? So that immediately from the Rambam's definition, we see that there's a certain relativeness going on here. That there's that we know that God exists, but we don't know what he is.
You're talking about the inner nature. How can we say we know?
We're not talking about the inner nature. That's what I'm saying.
Mahus is not inner nature of his being.
No, that's Rabbi Tauger's translation. It's a good translation too. What I'm saying is that you have to keep, in order to make sense of, for what I found reading this chapter, is that it helps to make sense of it if you realize that mahus means different things at different times. It's relative, right? There's the metzias, there's what it is, and there's the metzias, which is that it is. There's mahus, which is what it is. The Rambam says we know about God that he is, but we don't know what he is. What do we mean when we say that? We mean that we don't know God's inner essence, his inner being, what he truly is as unto himself. That doesn't mean that we don't know that God is God, if you understand what I'm saying, right? In other words, because that's what we're ultimately going to say. We're going to say that God, relativity. Sorry, we're going to say that God. We said in the previous chapter that you can know about God. You don't need faith to know that God is the most perfect of all beings, a necessary being. That's something you can know. So then, and that's the Rambam's definition of that's the Rambam's definition of faith, which is interesting. But so this is actually where the problems start, is because Kabbalah has it at a different level than the Rambam. Okay. The Rambam said in the last chapter that you can. Yeah. Let's use, according to the Rambam's definition. You know what? Let's make this simpler. According to the Rambam's definition, what does the Rambam say faith and knowledge are? As we said in the previous chapter, the Rambam says faith is that God exists. Am I making a mistake? Sorry. Maybe I'm misremembering this.
No, the faith is not that God exists according to the Rambam. You know that God exists.
No, the Rambam had a different definition.
I think Ronnie's right. I think that the Rambam said that I think that the Rambam said that you know that God exists. Faith is in this idea that He is the first being, that He is the most perfect being. Faith, the Rambam's faith is that God is the most perfect being. In other words, when the Rambam says, right, this is consistent with his words. The Rambam here is saying you can know that God exists, but you cannot know His inner nature. What does the Rambam mean? The Rambam means, according to what we said previously, that you can know that there is a God, but you cannot know that He is the most perfect being. For that you need.
It means to be the perfect.
For that you need faith. For that you need faith.
It's beyond understanding, is what you're saying. I believe that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's like you don't know what's inside of it. It's like, you know,
Kabbalah holds it to a different standard. What the Rambam means between you know that there must be something like this rather than knowing what that truly is, right? The Rambam says at the very simple level. I'm not sure. I'm worried I'm going to make a mistake. But
leave something unexpected.
Okay. The Rambam saying you can know that God exists, but you can't know what He is. And so too it is in all texts of the truth, in all books of the truth. Referring usually to Sifrei Kabbalah, referring to Kabbalah Sfarim. What he means to say is that from his actions we know that he exists. We do not understand how and what he is, how he does what he does, or what he is. Again, from his actions we know that he is there. Right? It's like gravity. Gravity is a good modern scientific example. From gravity's effect, we know that there is such a thing as gravity, right? Because of this distinction between knowing its effects and knowing it, Einstein was able to argue and was able to demonstrate that there is no such thing really as the force of gravity. It's a different discussion.
It's a good example.
Yeah. So from gravity, you know, because things fall down, right? At least on Earth, you know that there's a thing called gravity. Even though nobody's ever seen a wave of gravity, nobody knows how it works. This is really no, it's still true. No one's really demonstrated what it is. No force demonstrated. Also, gravity. There's no gravity particle. We just know it from its effects. So you know that it is, but you don't know what it is. So too, the Rambam is saying, so too with God. You know that He is here from His actions, but you don't know what He is. This is what it says in Eov, in Job. Can someone really reach an understanding of God? Cheker is an interesting word. The interesting translation is understanding. It's like, can someone investigate God? It's like, can you really,
research.
can you investigate? Can God really be investigated? Can God be researched? In other words, you only know His actions, you don't know Him. I guess we'll have to stop here. I was hoping to go further, but for some reason, those first few lines at the end of the first chapter took a long time.
No, because good.
This subject, it's like
God willing, next week. God willing, we'll continue next week.